6 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, I sat in a parked truck outside my father's house with a folder on the passenger seat that I believed could either save my family or finish the job my father had already started. I didn't go inside for 11 minutes. I want you to remember that number because by the end of this you'll understand exactly what those 11 minutes cost me and exactly what they bought back. But that's the end. Let me start where it actually started, with a lawyer who couldn't pronounce my name and an envelope that had no business being that heavy. Julian Foster? Julian, I said, raising my hand like I was back in 10th grade homeroom. It's Julian. He apologized, made a small mark on his legal pad, and slid a cream-colored envelope across the conference table toward me. The kind of paper that feels expensive before you've even opened it. My sister Nora sat to my left, 17 years old, still in her school cardigan because we'd come straight from picking her up, her knee bouncing under the table hard enough that I could feel the vibration through the floor. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and the stale, overcooled air of a building that keeps its AC too aggressive in every season. 3 floors down, a delivery truck idled with its hazards blinking, and I remember fixing my eyes on those lights through the entire reading, grateful for something small and mechanical to hold on to while my family quietly came apart around a pitcher of ice water nobody touched. I want to tell you this story started with that envelope. Didn't. It started 4 months earlier, in a hospital hallway that smelled like burnt coffee, when my grandfather took my hand with a grip that was somehow still strong and said, "Your grandmother's going to need you 2 more than she lets on." I didn't understand what he meant. I understood it about 90 seconds after I broke the seal on that envelope. Inside was a single folded page in her handwriting, the looping, old-fashioned cursive she used on birthday cards. Not a lawyer's language, just hers. Julian, by the time you read this I'll be gone, and I need you to not be angry at me for what I'm about to ask of you. There's more to this than money, and more to this than fairness. Ask Mr. Doyle for the second envelope when you're ready, not before. You'll know when you're ready. I looked up. Nora was already reading the same words over my shoulder, her lips moving slightly, silently. "There's a second envelope," she whispered, like she was afraid saying it any louder might make it disappear. I didn't tell my father about that note. Not that day, not that week. I wish now that I had, because I didn't know yet that the 6 weeks ahead of us would tear my family into pieces I'm still gluing back together one confession at a time. Or that the woman who wrote those looping cursive letters had spent 11 years hiding a secret that would eventually save all of us, including the 2 kids who, according to everything on paper, were about to get absolutely nothing. My mother left when I was 11. No slammed doors, no shouting matches for the neighbors to overhear. She just got quieter over the course of a year until one day she wasn't in the house anymore, and my father sat Nora and me down at the kitchen table and used the word disease more times than I could count. She'd struggled with pills since before I was born. Apparently, something he'd shielded us from until he physically couldn't anymore. I didn't hate her. I was too young to hate anyone properly. I just missed her, the way you miss a room in a house you can't go back to. My dad spent 3 years as a single parent working construction management shifts that started at 6 in the morning, and somewhere in the middle of that exhaustion he met Denise. Denise had 2 kids of her own. Paige, 6, who drew horses on every flat surface she could find, and Tyler, 3, who mostly wanted someone to chase him around a yard. Her first husband had left when Tyler was still in diapers and never once looked back. 2 broken marriages, 4 kids, 1 house on Ashgrove Lane. That was our family by the time I was 14, patched together the unglamorous way real families get patched together, one Tuesday dinner at a time. But the true center of gravity was 20 minutes away, in the brick ranch house my dad grew up in, where my grandparents Walter and Eleanor Foster held court every single Sunday. Walter called Paige and Tyler the bonus grandkids, and meant it with his whole chest. Eleanor kept a pencil growth chart on the pantry door, every kid's height marked without a single distinction between blood and step. I used to think that chart was the truest measurement of how our family actually felt about itself. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. Eleanor had one rule she repeated so often it became a kind of family scripture. Nobody left her table without saying one true thing. The year I turned 16, I told her I didn't want a 4-year degree, that I wanted to work with my hands, and I was terrified of disappointing my dad. She didn't blink. Your grandfather rewired this whole house in 1987 and it's still standing, she said. That's a fine thing to be good at. Walter just nodded from the other end of the table like a verdict had been delivered. Paige's one true thing, the year she was 10, nearly stopped my heart. She said she was scared nobody would come to her mock wedding to a stuffed elephant, because real families don't usually invite the extra cousins. Eleanor went very still, got up without a word, walked to the pantry door, and penciled in a new line on the growth chart even though Paige hadn't grown an inch. There, she said. Proof you were here. Proof doesn't lie, even when people worry it might. I didn't understand, at the time, how much weight that small gesture was carrying, or that Eleanor already knew something about Paige and Tyler's situation that none of the rest of us did. Walter got sick in March. Pancreatic cancer, caught late, the kind of diagnosis where doctors start using the word manage instead of the word cure. He lasted 11 weeks, and I spent almost every one of them at his bedside. I was 19 by then, apprenticing at an electrical contracting company, and Walter liked having me around because, he said, I was the only person left who didn't tiptoe. 2 weeks before he died, he said something that didn't make sense to me until it was far too late to ask him what he meant. Your grandmother's going to have decisions to make, he said, eyes fixed on a ceiling tile like it held the answer to something. About the will, about what's fair. I already told her what I think, but it's her call, and there's history there she hasn't told anybody. Not even me, not all of it. When it comes, don't let your father make it about himself. It was never about him. What history? I asked. He just shook his head, and for the first time in 11 weeks, I watched him choose not to fight for breath to finish a sentence. Ask her. If she wants you to know, she'll tell you. That's not mine to give away. He died on a Tuesday morning in April, Eleanor holding one hand, me holding the other. My father had stepped out for coffee. He never forgave himself for that timing, and I've come to believe that everything that happened later, the anger, the ultimatum, all of it, had its roots in that guilt, sitting underneath everything else like a stone under a rug nobody wanted to lift. At the funeral, Eleanor stood ramrod straight in her navy dress and thanked every person in the receiving line by name. She didn't cry until the house had emptied that night, and then she cried in the kitchen while I dried dishes beside her, and said the sentence that would haunt me for the next 4 months. I have some things to set right, Julian. Old things. I don't have much time to do it in, and I need to do it my own way, even if it makes people angry. I asked her what she meant. She only patted my cheek, the way she'd done since I was 6 years old. You'll see. Remember your grandfather's advice about the pot roast. Low and slow. Some things can't be rushed, even the hard ones. For months later, Eleanor followed him. Congestive heart failure, quick at the end, though nothing about losing your second parent in a single calendar year ever feels quick. The will reading happened on a Thursday, in a downtown office with a view of a parking garage. 9 grandchildren crowded into a room built for 6, me, Nora, my cousins from Aunt Carol, all 3 of Uncle Marcus's adopted kids, Uncle Dean's son. Every grandchild Eleanor had ever called a grandchild at her own Sunday table. Mr. Doyle read through the standard bequests first, calm and unhurried. The house, some jewelry, a modest stock portfolio. Then his voice changed register, and the whole room seemed to lean forward an inch. To each of the following named grandchildren, I leave the sum of $41,000, held in trust until their 25th birthday, or completion of a post-secondary degree or certified trade program, whichever comes first. He read 9 names. Mine, Nora's, all 4 cousins. Uncle Dean's son. He did not read Paige's name. He did not read Tyler's name. The air left the room like someone had cracked a window in winter. Denise's hand found the edge of the table like she needed it to stay upright. My father went very still. The specific stillness I'd learned over the years meant he was running numbers he already knew he wasn't going to like. Well, that can't be right, Aunt Carol said, and I don't think she meant it the way it landed. Mom loved those kids. Their pictures were on her fridge, same as everyone else's. My cousin Ellie, 13 and clearly wishing she were anywhere else, asked in a small voice if this meant Paige and Tyler weren't her cousins anymore. Nobody answered her. Nobody had an answer that made any sense yet. Mr. Doyle let the silence sit before he spoke again, The way I imagine a man learns to after a career of delivering exactly this kind of news to exactly this kind of room. "I want to be clear," he said. "The decedent was extremely specific about every line of this document. This was not an oversight, and she was not incapacitated when she drafted it. I reviewed her capacity personally twice, given the sensitivity here." His eyes found mine before he said the rest, like he already knew who'd be left holding it. She anticipated this reaction, and she left instructions accordingly. Then he said the sentence that would detonate slowly, over the following 6 weeks, in ways none of us could have predicted sitting in that room. The decedent also left a sealed letter for Julian Foster, to be opened at his own discretion, along with a second sealed letter, to be released only upon his request, per her explicit written instruction. That's the moment the cream envelope landed in my hands. That's the moment I learned there was a second one waiting behind it, and that whatever was inside it, my grandmother had trusted exactly one person in that room to decide when the rest of the family was ready to survive it. I didn't open it that day. I drove Nora home in silence, the envelope burning a hole in my jacket pocket, both of us already dreading the conversation we knew was coming. He waited 3 weeks before he said a word to us directly, which in hindsight was worse than if he'd exploded on the spot. 3 weeks of watching him go quieter and colder in a way that felt aimed at us specifically, even though neither Nora nor I had written a single line of that will. He asked us to lunch at Marrow's, the diner where he used to take us on Saturday mornings when it was just the 3 of us and a stack of pancakes and no family math to do. I think he picked it on purpose. I think some part of him hoped the booth would soften what he'd come to say. Didn't. The vinyl was the same cracked red I remembered from being 8, patched with silver duct tape gone soft and gray at the edges. The waitress who'd worked there since before I was born called my dad Han, and asked if we wanted the usual. And for one unguarded second, ordering pancakes on autopilot, I let myself believe this might just be a normal Saturday. Then walked away, and my father folded his hands on the table like he was about to say grace, and didn't touch his coffee once for the next 20 minutes. "I've been thinking a lot about fairness," he started, turning the mug in slow half-circles instead of drinking from it. "About what your grandmother would actually want, if she'd really thought it through." "Dad, she did think it through." My voice came out flatter than I meant it to. She was sick. She wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she was writing, word for word. She was hurting, and none of us know what pressure she was under at the end. He said it fast, rehearsed. "Paige and Tyler have called her grandma since they could talk. They have no other grandparents on either side. Denise's father died before Tyler was even born. Do you understand what that does to a 10-year-old? Finding out he wasn't really considered family." Nora's eyes were already filling. "That's not fair, Dad. We didn't write that will. We didn't choose this. I'm not asking you to fix what she did." His voice shifted, harder now, the voice he used on subcontractors who'd missed a deadline. "I'm asking you to fix what's inside your control. Split it 4 ways. You, Nora, Paige, Tyler. Equal shares. That's the only way this family survives what she did to it. And honestly, if you can't see that, I have to wonder what kind of people I actually raised. You're comparing us to Mom." I felt it coming the way you feel a storm arrive from the pressure change before the rain, the tightening in the air, the smell of it. "You've been doing it for 3 weeks. Every time we don't fall in line with you immediately, you get this look. Like you're seeing her instead of us." "I'm not." "You are, Dad. Say it isn't true." He didn't. That silence broke something in me faster than any shouted word could have. He looked down into his coffee and didn't deny it, and Nora made a small, wounded sound beside me that I will hear for the rest of my life. I put money on the table and told him we were leaving. "If you walk out of here without agreeing to this," he said, not loud, just flat, final, terrifying in how calm it was, "I don't know how we come back from that. I don't want to lose my own kids over money that isn't even in your hands yet. It's already ours, Dad." I stood, and Nora stood with me, shaking. "That's the whole point you're missing." We left him sitting alone in that booth. Nora moved most of her things into my apartment over the following 2 weeks, coming home only for school clothes, avoiding a house she said had gone quieter than any shouting match ever could. And somewhere in my glove box, still sealed, sat a second envelope I hadn't found the courage to open. One that I was starting to suspect held the only thing that could actually stop what was happening to us. I carried the weight of that unopened envelope for 6 weeks before I finally called Mr. Doyle and asked for it. I think I was afraid of what history nobody's been told might actually mean. I think some part of me suspected it would make everything worse before it made anything better, and I was already exhausted from things getting worse. I was right about the first part. The second envelope held 3 things: a letter, a bank document 11 years old, and a handwritten ledger page in Eleanor's cursive, dated the year Denise and my father married. The letter explained everything Walter had refused to hand me at the hospital. 11 years earlier, Eleanor had reached out to Denise's first husband's parents, Paige and Tyler's other paternal grandparents, a couple named the Averys, living 2 states away, people she'd met exactly twice in her life, because she'd learned they'd quietly set up an educational trust for both children after their son abandoned the family. Guilt money, in plain terms, meant to make up for a father who never would. Eleanor had wanted to add Paige and Tyler to her own will regardless, out of love, not obligation. But the Avery Trust carried an unusual clause, drafted by a cautious estate lawyer. Any additional inheritance from a non-blood relative past a certain threshold would trigger a recalculation of the trust's own payout formula, effectively shrinking what the Averys had already set aside, dollar for dollar. Eleanor refused to accidentally cost 2 children money they were already owed elsewhere. Her own lawyer confirmed it. Including Paige and Tyler in her will at the level she wanted could erase almost exactly what she was trying to give them. A zero-sum trap neither family had ever intended to build. So she built a workaround instead, and hid it in plain sight. The ledger page proved it: 11 years of quiet deposits into 2 custodial accounts registered under Denise's maiden name, Whitfield, structured as ongoing educational gifts rather than inheritance, invisible to the Avery Trust's formula because they weren't legally received the way a bequest would be. Deposited a little at a time. Completely legal. Completely deliberate. By the time she died, both accounts held just over $44,000 each. More than what she'd left me or Nora. She hadn't excluded Paige and Tyler because of blood. She had protected them in a way that only worked if it stayed hidden until exactly this moment. Her letter ended with a line I've read so many times I can recite it in my sleep. I could not tell your father because he would have found a way to feel guilty about it, or worse, entitled to manage it, and I needed this to belong to those 2 children cleanly, without any adult's fingerprints on it but mine. I'm trusting you, Julian, because you're the one who asked the right question at the hospital without me having to explain it twice. Tell your father the truth when you think he can bear it. Tell Denise sooner. She's owed that. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning with that ledger open in front of me, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I understood I was holding something that could actually stop my family from destroying itself. I also understood, with a cold certainty that kept me from sleeping, that I couldn't just walk into Ashgrove Lane and hand it over. Something told me I needed to be sure of every word first, and that instinct turned out to be the only thing that saved what happened next. I sat on the ledger for 2 more days, because I owed Eleanor certainty before I brought this into a family already coming apart at the seams. So I did the thing I probably should have led with. I called the number listed on the old trust paperwork, the law firm handling the Averys' affairs, and asked, as carefully as I knew how, whether anyone there would confirm what I was reading. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It wasn't a lawyer. I wondered if this call would ever come, said a woman's voice, worn soft at the edges like she'd rehearsed this moment for years without ever expecting to use it. This is Susan Avery. Your grandmother called me. Years ago, I want to say it was around the time Tyler turned 2. Paige and Tyler's paternal step-grandmother. A woman none of us had ever met because her son, the children's father, had cut off contact with everyone, his own parents included, around the same time he walked out on Denise. What she told me next wasn't in Eleanor's letter, because Eleanor, it turned out, hadn't wanted even the full truth written down where the wrong person might find it too soon. We built that trust out of guilt, Susan admitted, her voice tightening, but also out of fear. If our son's failures became too visible to your family, we were afraid Denise might lose leverage in some custody fight down the road, or worse, that those children would grow up defined by his absence instead of by the people who actually showed up. Your grandmother understood that fear immediately, because she'd lived a version of it herself. A fact your father never once heard, Julian. Not from her. Not from anyone. What do you mean? My hand had gone still on the phone. Eleanor's own mother, Susan said, was written out of her father's will entirely, back in the 50s, because she'd married beneath the family's expectations. Eleanor grew up hearing that story like a warning label. She told me once she'd spent her whole life promising herself she'd never let money decide who counted as family. When she learned about our trusts clause, she didn't want to fight us in court or drag your family's private business in front of a stranger. She wanted a workaround, so the two of us built one, quietly, over about 6 phone calls and more paperwork than either of us expected. I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since she'd said hello. Why didn't you ever tell Denise? In 11 years. There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Eleanor asked me not to, Susan said finally. She thought Denise already had enough to carry, building one family out of 2 broken ones, mostly alone in the early years. She didn't want to hand her one more relationship to manage before the money was solid enough to speak for itself. Her voice cracked, just slightly. And if I'm honest, I think your grandmother didn't want the credit either. She told me gratitude has a way of making people feel indebted. She didn't want those children to ever feel they owed her anything for simply being loved. Susan mailed me copies of the original correspondence within the week. 6 letters, spanning 11 years, businesslike on the surface, quietly devastating underneath. 2 women on opposite ends of a fractured family, working in secret so that 2 children would never learn how close they'd come, for one legally tangled year, to being loved less on paper than they were loved at every single Sunday table where a pencil mark on a pantry door said otherwise. I had the proof now. What I didn't have yet was any idea how badly it was about to get twisted by the one person I trusted most to help me fix things. I want to tell you I marched straight into Ashgrove Lane and fixed everything with one dramatic reveal. That isn't what happened. 2 things went sideways first, and they're worth telling because they're the parts nobody expects going in. The first was Uncle Marcus. Word had started leaking through the extended family that there was more to the story than the original will suggested. I hadn't said anything to anyone yet, but families don't need confirmation to start speculating. They just need a silence long enough to fill. Marcus, whose own adopted kids had been included in the original trust, had always been the one who managed things. The group chat, the birthday reservations, the family calendar nobody else could keep straight. Apparently, watching his siblings circle each other for 3 sleepless weeks broke something loose in him, because he drafted an informal letter, before I'd told him a single fact about the second envelope, proposing to route the disputed trust funds through a new family LLC for tax efficiency, with himself listed as managing member and broad discretion over disbursement timing. I found out the way you find out about most bad ideas in a family like mine, sideways through Aunt Carol on the phone, assuming I already knew. Then Mr. Doyle's office called me directly, their tone carefully neutral in the way lawyers get when they're about to ruin someone's week. They'd flagged irregular banking language on a document Marcus had filed. A document carrying a signature scanned from an old birthday card Eleanor had once sent his youngest daughter. I need you to understand the severity of this, Doyle told me, and for the first time in 6 weeks I felt something colder than grief settle in my stomach. If funds had moved under that document, we'd be looking at outright fraud on an estate. As it stands, it's an attempted, unauthorized modification. Serious, but contained for now. Marcus was called in. I wasn't there for it, but Doyle described him afterward as cooperative and immediately remorseful once confronted. Reading between those careful lawyer lines, I think Marcus had genuinely convinced himself, somewhere in those sleepless weeks, that seizing control of the money was protection rather than what it actually was, an attempt to make an unbearable situation feel survivable by making it his to manage. No charges were filed once it was clear nothing had actually moved. He apologized to the whole family at Thanksgiving with the specific, red-faced mortification of a man who'd believed, right up until the moment he got caught, that he was the one holding everyone together. The second thing that went sideways was harder, and it happened with Denise in a coffee shop without my father there, the week before I finally opened my mouth in front of everyone. I told her about the custodial accounts first, gently, watching her face for a full 10 seconds before she said anything at all. When she finally spoke, it wasn't gratitude. It was grief. "She never once made me feel less than," Denise said, meaning Eleanor. Her hands wrapped so tight around her coffee cup her knuckles had gone white. "Not once in 7 years. And this whole time I've been telling myself this was about me not being enough. That whatever's wrong with my kids' lives is something I did." She told me something none of us had known. That months earlier, completely by accident, Tyler had mentioned Grandma and Grandpa's money, in an offhand way that had quietly terrified her, because her own parents were long gone and her ex-husband's family had never so much as sent a birthday card. She'd spent weeks certain that Walter and Eleanor had somehow learned about her first marriage and judged her, or her kids, for it. That fear, she admitted, was part of why she'd never once pushed back on my father's anger. Some buried part of her believed she deserved the exclusion, that it confirmed something she'd spent a decade trying to outrun. That was the moment I finally understood the actual shape of everything that had happened. Nobody in this story was a villain. My father wasn't cruel. He was grieving, guilty, and terrified of losing the second family he'd built after his first one fell apart. Denise wasn't manipulative. She was carrying a decade-old wound that had nothing to do with any of us and everything to do with how she'd been taught to expect abandonment. Marcus wasn't scheming, he was panicking badly, in the specific way people panic when they mistake control for love. And the will that had looked so cold on paper had, in fact, been the single most careful act of love in the entire family. A woman spending 11 years hiding a kindness because hiding it was the only way to keep it safe. I had everything I needed now. What I didn't know, walking into that final dinner, was whether it would be enough to undo 3 weeks of damage in a single evening, or whether some of what my father had said at Marrow's had already broken something that no ledger page could fix. I called the dinner myself at my apartment, small enough that everyone had to sit closer together than they wanted to, which I did on purpose. I wanted no distance left in that room for anyone to hide behind. I laid the ledger pages flat on my coffee table like evidence in a trial nobody had asked to attend. I explained the Avery Trust, its formula, the accounts under Whitfield, 11 years of quiet, deliberate deposits nobody was ever supposed to have to notice. I watched my father's face move through 4 different expressions before it landed somewhere I hadn't seen since Walter's funeral. Grief, fresh and raw. For a mother he was only now realizing he'd never fully known. 11 years, he said, quietly, staring at his mother's handwriting like it might rearrange itself into something less final. 11 years, and she never told me. Why wouldn't she tell me? Because she thought you'd try to manage it, I said, as gently as I could manage with my own hands shaking. Or feel so guilty about it you'd make it about yourself instead of them. She wanted it clean, Dad. For once, she wanted something in this family that didn't have anyone's fingerprints on it, but her own. He didn't answer right away. He looked, instead, at Paige and Tyler curled together on my couch, not fully understanding the financial architecture of what I just explained, but understanding, the way kids always understand, that something enormous about whether they belonged had just been settled permanently in their favor. "I'm sorry," he said, and it came out cracked, nothing like the flat, rehearsed voice from Marrow's. He looked at all 4 of us, but his eyes stayed longest on Nora, because she'd cried the hardest that day at the diner. "I said things about your mother I had no right to say. I made you 2 carry a fear that was mine to carry. That's on me. Not on Grandma. Not on either of you. I was so scared of losing this family that I almost became the reason we lost it. It wasn't a magic fix, and I won't pretend it was." Nora didn't move back to Ashgrove Lane for another 4 months. There were harder conversations after that dinner, not fewer, including one my father asked me to sit beside him for at his own kitchen table when he finally called our biological mother, 2 years into recovery and, it turned out, desperate for any door back into our lives, however small. Neither of them said anything for the first 30 seconds, just 2 people breathing on opposite ends of a line that had been dead a long time. Then she said, "I heard about your parents. I'm so sorry. Richard. Eleanor was always kind to me. Even at the end, even when she didn't have to be." My father's jaw worked before he could answer. "I've been unfair to the kids," he said. "I think I've been unfair to you too, for a long time in a different way. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a door propped open half an inch, And Nora cried again at that table, a completely different kind of crying than the kind at Marrow's. Denise started therapy that fall, not because anyone pushed her to, but because she said she was tired of carrying shame that was never hers to hold. Months later, over that same pot roast recipe she'd learned for my sake years earlier, she told me the hardest part had never been the will itself. It had been realizing how long she'd quietly believed she was one bad season away from being asked to leave her own life. A fear built by a man who'd abandoned her once already, and never fully undone by anyone since, including herself. Eleanor undid a little of it, she said, without me even knowing she was doing it. That's the kindest thing anyone's ever done for my kids. And she never once made it about her. Marcus and my father had their own reckoning about the forged document, one I wasn't present for and don't know every detail of, except that it ended with an apology and an unbearably awkward hug at a 4th of July barbecue. Both men pretending, the second it ended, that it hadn't happened at all, the way the men in my family tend to do. The house on Ashgrove Lane sold that spring, along with the ranch house Walter and Eleanor had lived in for 4 decades, and for a while I dreaded losing both buildings in the same year would feel like losing them all over again. Didn't. Denise had the pantry door itself unscrewed hinge by hinge before the sale closed, my father helping her carry it out to the truck without either of them saying much of anything, and mounted it on the wall of the smaller place they bought together closer to Nora's school. The pencil marks are still there, faded in places, Paige's initials beside Tyler's, beside mine, beside Nora's. No line anywhere separating who belonged by blood from who belonged because they showed up every single Sunday for 11 years running. Tyler got his dog last Christmas, a scruffy shelter mutt Walter would have approved of completely. Paige is 15 now and has traded horses for houseplans, informing anyone who'll listen that she's going to be an architect. And I try not to read too much into the fact that a girl once terrified nobody would come to her mock wedding now spends her free time designing rooms big enough to hold everyone she loves. My father calls me every Sunday now, not to check in exactly, just to talk, the way I imagine he used to talk to his own mother before grief and guilt made it hard for him to sit still inside a conversation. Our biological mother comes to dinner twice a month now, careful and a little shy still, but present, which is more than any of us expected to be true a year ago. As for the money, mine and Nora's trusts matured exactly the way Eleanor planned, untouched by any of the family's noise. I used part of mine 2 years later to finish the electrical engineering degree I'd once been too scared to admit I wanted. Paige and Tyler's accounts will fully vest the moment they each turn 18. Protected, invisible, exactly the way Eleanor built them to be, until the day they finally needed to be seen. I still keep the ledger page in my desk drawer, the one where her cursive marks out 11 years of deposits nobody was ever meant to notice. Sometimes I take it out and read the line she added at the very bottom, after the final entry, like she already knew someday somebody would have to read the whole thing before they'd understand. Love isn't always loud, Julian. Sometimes it's just patient. Low and slow like the pot roast. Tell them I said so. I did. Eventually, I told every one of them. And for the first time since that hospital hallway that smelled like burnt coffee, our family's growth chart started measuring something other than height, and none of us have stopped growing since.